Good day, faithful students. Professor Pontificate here. Your course instructor, Mr. Alberhaski, has politely requested that I talk to you today about the canonical story format. One reason that films make so much sense to us, and so easily too, is that filmmakers rely on a basic structural format for telling stories, called the canonical story format. The canonical story format is not unique to film. It's a slight variation on a much older form that dates back to ancient Greece. The canonical story format has four basic moves. The first of which is exposition. In the exposition, we are introduced to characters who are situated in a setting. This involves setting up some psychologically plausible, goal-driven characters that relate one to another. The exposition, in a sense, sets the stage for what comes next, the second move of the canonical story format, called the complication. The complication involves the introduction of some element of conflict that presents itself as a series of obstacles to our character's goals and rises in intensity until it reaches the third move of the canonical story format, the climax. The climax is the moment of highest intensity in the story. Think of your superhero movie. It's when the ultimate good guy finally faces off against the ultimate bad guy. Stories typically don't end at the climax, but typically what follows is called the denouement, the fourth move of the canonical story format. In the denouement, a resolution is reached of the narrative. Some sort of narrative equilibrium is achieved, and we have a new sense of normal that's established at the end of the film. Now, conventional plot also relies on what I call the 3 C's and the 2 D's, which hopefully doesn't refer to your report card from last semester, though if it does, could be worse. The 3 C's are causality, conflict, and closure, and your 2 D's are deadlines and dual structure. Now, causality refers to the cause and effect. This is to say that one scene sets up the next scene. Remember, in the 4 motivation lectures, I explained how one primary way viewers make sense out of filmic material is through compositional motivation. And this is on the side of the viewer. It's what the viewer actively does while watching the film. Causality refers to the elements in the plot and how they're linked one with another, how they unfold. Recall, if you will, the example I gave about a character who in scene 1 is on the phone talking to a friend and suggests having lunch. Scene 2, we see them seated at a table waiting for their friend. We know that scene 1 causes scene 2 to happen. This is causality par excellence. We can relate conflict, the second C, back to the complication of the canonical story format. The film plot is working on developing and resolving some element of conflicts. In this regard, conflict is inherent to narrative. It's my contention that narrative is a consolation to humanity, a necessary structure that provides us with a sort of working out of experiences and conflicts that we experience in the world. Should we live in paradise, a perfect world, it's my contention that narrative would be superfluous. In such a world we do not live, and thus we have narrative to assuage that inexorable reality. Conflict in narrative can be a variety of different types. Intrapersonal, which means that there's conflict within a character. Interpersonal conflict is between two or among more than 2 characters. Characters can also be in conflict with society, or even with nature, or if you like, some cosmic force or a godlike figure. The third C is closure, which means that films work their conflicts through to some logical endpoint, and on some level resolve the conflict. This is not to say that everything must be happily resolved by the end of the film. Sometimes a resolution is most unfortunate for our characters, but that is to say that there must be some closure to the film. Occasionally a film will end without denouement. It will simply end at the climax, leaving the viewer bereft of denouement. And for the most part, viewers tend to dislike that lack of closure. If you've ever reached the end of a film and thought, no, it can't end here, it was most likely the case that the film lacked denouement. It lacked closure. Now, some people have a higher tolerance for ambiguous endings, films that lack closure, and in some cases there might be a perfectly good reason why a filmmaker has decided to withhold closure. It may very well give the viewer something to think about after the credits have rolled and the viewer has left the theater. Plot is also typically organized around some sort of deadline. The deadline might be extremely explicit. For example, in the heist film, we know at the very beginning of the film when and where exactly the heist will take place. Other times the deadline might be more vague. In the detective film, the deadline might be whether or not the detective will find the criminal before he strikes again. Now, we might not know when and where the criminal is going to strike, or if the detective will be successful in stopping the criminal, but it's still an operative deadline nonetheless. The second D is dual structure. Typically, Hollywood plot is organized around a romantic plot line, so-called topic A in Hollywood lingo. Conventionally, this will revolve around a heterosexual couple. A second plot line will involve work. Now, work does not necessarily mean the occupation of the character, but it's whatever work needs to be accomplished in the film. Take, for instance, Alfred Hitchcock's film Rear Window. The protagonist, L.B. Jeffries, is a photojournalist. However, the work to be accomplished in this film does not involve photojournalism, but rather amateur sleuthing. Jeff must figure out whether his neighbor has murdered his wife. Thus, the work to be accomplished has nothing to do with Jeff's occupation. You may wonder, why do filmmakers use the canonical story format? Well, for one, it's an easy tool when writing a screenplay or telling a story. Secondly, it functions as a structural schemata. A schema is a knowledge structure in our brains that helps us process new information by building on what we already know. When we repeatedly watch films that conform to the canonical story format, we're beefing up that structural schemata so that when we watch new films, we can easily understand what's going on. What happens when we watch films that don't conform to a canonical story format is that we may be confused while we're watching them. Because whether we consciously know this or not, we're primed to anticipate certain clues and plot moves, and when these expectations are not met, we often make judgments like, this film is boring, this film is strange, this film is confusing, this film is artsy. Now, I realize that some people are apt to judge a film primarily on the grounds of instrumental interest, which means, does the film entertain me? Does the film bore me? Such judgments ask only what the film can do for me. Does it give me pleasure? Then it is good. Does it bore me? Does it challenge my ideology? Then it is bad. Such an approach to film is very egocentric and materialistic, a function of a consumer society. My approach to film is based on cognitive grounds, the belief that the film has value in and of itself, independent of me, and consequently exists not simply for my pleasure. My first question is not, does the film entertain me, but rather, what is the text trying to do? Thus I approach the film on its own terms, to try to learn its intentions, and then situate it within the historical and social circumstances. And then I can evaluate a film to decide whether it has been successful or not. So never ask me if I like a film. Instead, ask me what I learned from a film. Ask me what a film is doing. Ask me how a film can be situated within the historical constraints of its trajectory. You may, of course, ask your instructor, Mr. Alberhasky, what films he likes, because the man has far more social graces than I. So for now, I'm off to the life of the mind. So long until next time.